So I'm going to talk about those, and my sort of agenda is to talk about prescribed fire first. That's where we have most of the research data. I'm going to talk briefly about public findings, more specific, although a lot of what I talked about in the first presentation was based on research that was looking at social acceptability of prescribed fire. And then I'm going to talk sort of about findings we have about manager perceptions. And then I'll spend a little time on wildland fire use. That's the term I use. It changes constantly. There's a lot less research specific to that topic. So I'll just talk really briefly about what little we know about manager findings and about public findings, or at least the research I've been involved with. There have been a couple other studies that were done like 20 years ago. And so I'm going to go back to how I started the last presentation about fire management is a social process and kind of build on that, and thinking about why is it a social process, because social dynamics, they basically are what determine what we value, and that then determines the decisions we make. And so to think about how, like where we are now, is a result of value changes. So, you know, when we started suppressing fire, the things that we really valued were sort of control of nature and commodity production and protection of sort of those commodities. And over time, we've sort of, our values have shifted to be more focused on environmental values as well as economic values, cultural values, and all of those have been added into the mix, which then shifts the way we think about managing our landscape and what our decisions need to be. And so I think part of what we're dealing with now is sort of figuring out how do we include all those values in the mix appropriately. And that's not, it's much easier when you're just like, it's economics, it's commodity, that's very clear. But when you're trying to integrate these really different values that people don't always agree on, that's what makes it really complicated. And I think that's a lot of what we're kind of trying to sort out now. So to go back to that graphic about what we know, is just to kind of highlight that this graphic, it really is about prescribed fire as much as anything. So as long as you sort of are working to build knowledge about prescribed fire and trust, and you know, using an interactive communication practice, that's really what you need to build social acceptance of prescribed fire. So I don't need to do a lot more detail on that, except I will kind of touch on this middle goal about concerns. Because concerns about escape and concerns about smoke, as sort of Pete highlighted, are very relevant for prescribed fire. The other comment I will say is that concerns about other things like aesthetics and wildlife, in research, they've sort of shown that those as often are the reason people support a practice as why they don't. So, hey, it actually makes the habitat nicer for the species I care about. So, but with fire, escape and smoke are significantly associated with lower acceptance of prescribed fire. So the higher your concern about escape or smoke, the lower your acceptance. But the kind of cool thing is that with prescribed fire, that the knowledge that's really critical is the ecological benefits are particularly important. The more that people understand the ecological benefits, the lower their concern goes. And that is for both smoke and for escape. So the more they get the ecology, the more comfortable or accepting they are, maybe not comfortable with smoke. And trust gets in there too, because trust is a key part of escape. One study found that one increase in trust in the people implementing a prescribed fire led to a 6-point increase in acceptance of prescribed fire. So if you work on that knowledge and the trust, that's how you get to increased building social acceptability prescribed fire, and you can overcome these negative outcomes. There was a study actually in Spokane from almost 20 years ago where they recruited a group of people for a focus groups who were anti-smoke, and they were mostly parents or people who had some family member who had a health issue. And as those groups progressed and they started talking about the ecological benefits, one of the members of the group said, you know, I was really against prescribed burning because of smoke and my health of my kid, but the more I'm learning about the ecological benefits, I care about those too. You know, I care about my kid's health, but I care about the health of the landscape. And I'm beginning to think that prescribed fire is, the smoke from prescribed fire is okay. And that's actually a little frustrating. So I want to care about my kid, but I care about this other thing. So as Pete said, it's a health issue for at least, I think he's right, it's just at least a third of households. And so for this group, it's highly salient. When we do other studies have sort of shown that for the majority of the population who don't have a health issue, it's more of a nuisance issue, inconvenience, and it becomes more of an issue the longer it goes on because the inconvenience becomes bigger. But for most of them, it's not actually a very important variable, but for people who has a health issue or a concern, for them, it's highly salient. And so they are going to care, they are going to pay attention. I am somebody with asthma, and last summer we had the Cameron Peak fire outside my door for 2 months, which had good smoke. And I just need to say that I was very dependent on those ARA reports that Pete told you about, because they were very handy for me in being able to figure out like what I could or couldn't do or planning ahead. And that kind of fits into how the health and the smoke work, which is the studies also show that people understand that there's trade-offs. As I said, sort of with that Spokane example, they're willing to tolerate some smoke if there are benefits. The ecological benefits sort of outweigh it. So, you know, people will make trade-offs. And this is where I think prescribed fire and smoke really have the advantage. It's not now, do you want smoke now or later? It's really, we can manage the smoke. We have a greater ability with prescribed fire to manage the smoke. We can plan ahead. We can hopefully give you warning so you can plan ahead. You can get that equipment. We can, you know, we're also planning to try to minimize smoke impacts on the community, looking at wind and all the other techniques. And we can also minimize duration. I think duration is one of the things that we haven't paid enough attention to, at least in the research. Is like, what's the cutoff point where people are no longer tolerant? But I think that is really the key selling point with prescribed fire and smoke, is the ability to manage the smoke is greater. So kind of the takeaway I took from what I've described about social acceptance is that that's not the problem. Like that is something where if you put the outreach into it, we can have social acceptance of prescribed fire. And where I've kind of concluded, listening to the conversations, is that the bigger issues tend to be internal agency considerations. So I've had the good fortune to become involved in 2 studies more recently that have been looking explicitly sort of like internally. And I'm going to touch on sort of what the findings from those are in terms of sort of the internal considerations about what the real barriers are to use of prescribed fire. And this is from the first study is from, we did interviews of 11 Western states. They were sort of state level key informant interviews of land managers, state forestry, air regulators, prescribed fire councils when they had one, to sort of just get an overview of within your state, what are the key barriers? And what we found is that the primary barrier, which I think a few other people have mentioned, it's really about lack of funding capacity to burn. Do we have the money? Do we have the people? Do we actually have the proper knowledge? So it sort of boils down to the people to plan, prepare, and execute a burn, the right people at the right time. The other thing that kind of came up was the importance of leadership and personal commitment. You really do have to, it's 2 parts, the personal commitment of the managers on the ground to make things happen. I know there's a number of people in this group listening who are those people who have a personal commitment to make it happen on the ground, and that is critical. You kind of have to have that, but they also have to have leadership who supports them and has their back when they do it. And that's where you see more fire on the ground. It's when you have those 2 things come together. We did hear that local environmental issues could be a barrier. Endangered species, particularly Bureau of Land Management lands with sage-grouse, that could inhibit. Invasive species, particularly cheatgrass. In Utah, we actually heard that the prescribed fire acreage had been going down, and in large part it was due to the challenges of trying to do prescribed burns at the right time so that you didn't actually encourage cheatgrass as opposed to discourage it. So that can be an issue. And the study started with the notion of air quality as the primary barrier. And what we heard is really not the primary barrier. And I think the quote is critical because I think this person nailed it. And we heard something similar from a lot of people. Yeah, there are people who choose to use smoke management as an excuse not to get things done because it's the scapegoat that no one questions. And what we heard that version of that statement, and what a lot of people said was sort of like, yeah, Air quality could be an issue if we were actually burning at the level that we kind of would like to. Then it might become a bigger issue. But right now we just don't have the resources or ability to burn at the level we do. And even then, a number of people sort of said, we're not even sure that it would be an issue then, because over the past 20 years, we've really put the effort into building relationships with air quality regulators. They kind of recognize the need, they're willing to work with us. We've sort of built some trust into the system. We did see local exceptions. So there were places where air quality was a bigger issue. Those tended to be areas where they were near population centers, or they had a lot of competing pollutants, such as the Central Valley of California. And then there were Oregon and Washington State had very restrictive smoke management standards. And so for there, it was an issue. And I believe that both those states have made some changes to those standards to try to create more flexibility. So we also talked about opportunities and what helped get things done. And we heard a lot about the importance of coordination and relationships, that particularly when you have resource constraints, you really need to have those relationships to make things happen. Relationship coordination amongst burners to sort of share resources, but also to sort of share the airspace. You know, if there's a good burn day, whose burn was a priority if we need to limit that. And those relationships with air quality regulators. Both of those practices helped facilitate resource sharing, both financially and people-wise. And it helped sort of build trust. So air quality regulators were like, you know, I trust you, you're not having one over on me, so I can approve this. They did note that can really, doing that effectively can really require dedicated bridging positions. So a person whose job was to sort of act as the go-between. And that if you really want to engage in a lot more resource sharing than that, particularly when you're talking about the agency level, that requires more capacity to develop those agreements and enter into those agreements. So a very practical kind of administrative requirement. And at the same time, in talking about this coordination relationships, they talked sort of about the need for a multi-level governance approach. So it's not a barrier at one level or one opportunity at one level. Sort of the federal has its role to play, the state has its role to play, you know, local government, local agencies. And so they all kind of need to do their part to facilitate things. So it's sort of this multi-level governance approaches that take into account these different scales. A number of people talked about the need to sort of create organizational structures that are similar to wildfire, where you can just, you know, enter into a system here, we need this many personnel in this time, and you could get it. And to create some sort of dedicated prescribed burning capacity so that they have people available and who that's what their job is. And their job isn't wildfire, it's prescribed fire. Air quality, they were still, you know, even though they said it wasn't a major barrier or the limiting factor, everybody was still working on developing ways to make it easier. And one of the key things was sort of improving smoke modeling for their area and using better use of monitoring, like local monitors on their prescribed burns. And a lot of that was to sort of better tailor the restrictions to local conditions. So in a number of places, the restriction was that the air quality standard was a state level air quality standard. And so for instance, in Utah, it was a state level standard that had to be acceptable to burn, except for it was often based on the valley, and they get inversions. So people above the inversion had great air quality, but they still couldn't burn. So it's about sort of figuring out ways that they can do a better job of communicating their local conditions, so to meet restrictions or to have tailor those restrictions. And then I also was involved in a survey of line officers in the Forest Service. And I'm guessing a lot of people here know what a line officer is, but for those who don't, basically in the Forest Service, the line officer is the person who has decision-making authority for that area of a forest, whether it's a district ranger or a forest supervisor. And the prescribed fire burn plan and implementation will all be done by the fire organization part of the group, but it has to be signed off by a line officer. So we surveyed all the district rangers and forest supervisors and deputies across the Forest Service in 2018. I think we got responses back from a little over half. And one of the questions we asked is, what are the top 2 factors limiting prescribed fire? And here you're going to see a lot of similarity with what I was just talking about. Most mentioned factors were burn windows and implementation resources. That's interesting. There we go, sorry. And basically to do it. And almost 20% of the responses, the top 2 limiting factors were those 2. Small burn windows, lack of personnel on burn day. And then the next most common was those planning resources to write the NEPA, to write the burn plans, so to hire the specialists. And they talked also about the specialists who could actually have the time to work on the burn plans and weren't having to work on other things like timber plans. Okay, advancing is being weird. And I wanted to sort of highlight how there are a lot of topics that often come up that we talk about, but they were actually only mentioned by less than 20% of respondents. And that would be air quality and smoke issues. This notion of social license. So again, it's that I think social license and sort of public acceptance falls into the same category as that quote I gave you about we use air quality as an excuse. I think social license is often an excuse. I was working with one forest where I interviewed everybody separately and said, what's your biggest barriers? And it was all the resources, and I would explicitly say, what about external and public acceptance? And they'd be like, oh yeah, that's not a problem. But then when they actually got together as a group to discuss their planning and what their plans were, it was fascinating how everybody just defaulted to, oh yeah, we'd like to do that, but we just don't have the social license. And it was just this really, I was like, but you told me it wasn't. So a really classic example of how social license is being used sort of more as an excuse than an actual reality. We also didn't hear a lot about internal, the survey also didn't say a lot about internal concerns or other large scale priorities such as the WUI that often comes up. We also asked people about what about large scale prescribed fire? And we heard very similar comments as prescribed fire with a few shifts. And those tended to be around the increased complexity about doing a larger burn. They take longer and longer duration, so we're less certain of having resources. Smoke becomes a bigger issue. And then, we're pulling people away from their jobs for longer periods. And then the question about, do we actually have personnel with the skill set to burn larger areas? And helicopter availability came up because that was seen as the best way to ignite large scale burns. And then we also saw more consideration of those other land management issues such as grazing, inholdings, endangered species, and that's kind of coming up more because, larger scale, it's harder to avoid those, which you can with smaller burn planning, sort of not just don't plan your burn there. We asked explicitly, is funding actually a barrier to achieving your goals? And 2/3 said yes, but notably a third said no, it's really not an issue at all, or it's not really the limiting factor. And so I think that's just important to remember that whenever we come up with these barriers and stuff of that sort of, it's variable. And so it's not inherent in every location. Those who it was a barrier, we sort of saw 3 interrelated barriers coming up. Sort of you needed the right funds. So you needed money that could actually be used for prescribed burning, and you needed them at the right time. So in the Forest Service, there can be a lot of unpredictability about how much money you have and when it will be available. And that creates huge uncertainties around burns, and it can make it challenging. It limits your willingness to hire actual permanent staff. You may not have the money available, or you may not know how much money when it's a good burn window in your community. So for instance, our fiscal year ends at the end of September, and a lot of places their best burn window is September and October. And in September, you may have no money left. And in October, we may not have a budget passed, so you can't actually spend money until you know what you have. So they talked about that, and then sort of increased use of competitive processes where there's a pool of money and the different forests compete. They said that just makes it harder to predict our year-to-year funding and plan ahead. And then they talked about the need to fund the necessary workforce. So they talked about how we don't have enough permanent trained staff. That makes it hard to plan and burn. We rely on seasonal staffing, and that's kind of an outdated staffing model. We sort of are relying on the people we hire to be firefighters, and they're being available to do prescribed burns, but they often, they time out when it's our burn season. And a lot of people push towards saying we need year-round prescribed fire staffing. That would be more cost effective. We wouldn't have to train people, and we could take advantage of burning when we need to burn and do a lot of prep work in the winter, and it would just be more efficient. We did look to see if there's differences between the various Forest Service regions, and we didn't find tons, but we found a few, and that there it seemed to be dominated by one region. So a couple examples. Region 5, which is basically California, they had more issues with personnel availability limitations for implementing prescribed fire. And that was a less important issue in Region 1, which is Montana, Idaho, and then Region 9, which is the Northeast. In Region 6, which is the Pacific Northwest, timber and smoke concerns were more important. The smoke concerns kind of totally reflects what I said from the previous study, that they have more restrictive smoke standards there at the time. And timber is just, that's the area where there is a lot of timber harvest still. And so that's an issue for both the community, but also because of industry points of view. Less sure of the level of prescribed fire support from government stakeholders and homeowners in the other regions. And I am still kind of trying to figure that one out. And then interestingly, Region 3, which is basically Arizona and New Mexico, it was really stuck out because across the board for, their answers were always just slightly more positive, or at least, or a lot more positive compared to the other regions. And statistically, significantly speaking, they were more likely to indicate that they burn larger acreages, both prescribed fire and wildfire resource benefit fires, which we also asked about. And that stakeholder groups were very supportive, that strongly agreed that they were encouraged by leadership, and that personal liability concerns were not a consideration. And I think you see there how the various factors that we identified as barriers in the first study kind of come together here to not be there. And they have the leadership, and the leadership, I'm told, basically said, we want you to burn more land. Go out there, figure out how to do it. Don't worry about having the resources. We'll figure that out. And so people did. Cross-cutting themes that came out, again, that idea of leadership. And what came out in the survey in this one was that it needs to be consistent leadership. So the comment that people were kept on making is, you're telling us to burn more, but you're not giving us the resources to do that. So that's not really a consistent leadership. That support can vary depending upon the fire season, both between years and within the year. And when it gets really bad, you tend to, even when we're in a situation where we could burn and we have the resources to do it, we're told we can't. And then it was actually really striking how often I saw the words, "don't have my back." There was just basically a lack of confidence that leadership would support them if something went wrong. The importance of partnerships came up, particularly larger scale, that communication that we saw in the other study, and desire for creation of a larger scale prescribed burn organization, very similar to the other study. So managed fire, we have a lot less of data on that. I like to point out how hard it is to talk about because we change the name of it all the time. I prefer wildland fire use. In this study, we used wildfire for resource benefits because that was what the term at the time. And so that study I was talking about, that survey, we also asked about wildland resource benefit fires. And there we really did find that resource availability was the dominant barrier. Most people were making statements in reference to preparedness level 4 or 5, and that's basically just how bad the fire season is and how many resources are available, and sort of saying that when it got to PL 4 or 5, leadership tended to get more hesitant to release resources to do prescribed burns. I have not, outside of the study, talked to forests where they're like, we could actually get a wildfire resource benefit done because we just couldn't get the resources to justify full suppression. So we went with less aggressive response. The social comes up more once we start talking about this. So do internal concerns about support for wildfire resource benefit fires. Then the culture of, firefighting just as a culture of suppression. That's their instinct. That's what they want to do. And specialists also came up that resource specialists could often be kind of saying, we don't know about our resource. Risk management aversion, lack of incentives. Basically, they said culture, culture, culture. So I was also involved with focus groups where we asked people in communities about how would you feel about letting natural fires burn? And in 2004, we sort of just framed it that way. And the first response was, no, that's a terrible idea. But the next response was always, but what do you mean? How would that work? And once they understood how it would work, then the answer became, oh yeah, of course you should be doing that. That's a no-brainer. If you can let some fires burn, you ought to let them burn. And that's like the no-brainer is San Bernardino, which I think most people would expect as an area that would not be okay with that. But basically, once they knew the amount of planning, they were good. We did repeat focus groups in 2014. We got rid of that first discussion by having a very clear explanation in our question. And then the answer was basically always across the board. Yep, that's a good idea. So ways to fight fires if they don't need to. So I say yes, and everybody was nodding their heads. We need to manage where it burns rather than put it out. Key themes, that knowing about the planning and evaluation that has happened is kind of the critical one. When they know that, it's much more acceptable. They do recognize fire's ecological role and management's role in creating the current situation. I just love this quote. I think we are the problem. The forest was doing fine before we came along. It was supposed to burn. That was supposed to be fires. And if we could just behave ourselves and let the forest take care of itself. And they do recognize that there's trade-offs that have to be made. Qualifiers, they are more tolerant when it's not human cause. They are more comfortable when it's in the backcountry and there's not houses exposed. And there are people who are just more comfortable when they have more confidence that it's under control. Just quickly, the variables that I talked at the beginning, they become even more important during, because during the uncertainty is heightened. And so people really want to decrease uncertainty. And in those contexts, better knowledge, trusting the people you're talking to, ability to ask questions becomes even more important. And knowing that the local knowledge and resources are being accounted for and used. If you want to make sure people think a fire was poorly managed, ignore local knowledge and resources. And transparent communication becomes even more important because it's a really fast way for people to reduce uncertainty and assess trust. So in sum, I'm going to change it from assess your notion of the imagined public to assess your notion of the imagined problem. Oftentimes we seem to think the problem is air quality and social license, but they may be less of a barrier than we often think they are. Knowing about the planning and thinking behind decisions is important to the public. Resources to plan and implement are a key internal constraint. Relationships and partnerships are key, especially for larger acreage. And consistent leadership and personal commitment matter. And I'm going to end with advice that we asked at the end of the focus groups. Okay, this was funded by the Forest Service. What one piece of advice would you give? I've always found this basically summarizes the advice. And I think it actually is a pretty good way of answering that question asked the first time about how do you work with a community that doesn't trust us? Yes, this is the dominant thing people said. Could you please tell us who you are, what you do, and why are you doing it? We realized in this discussion, we really don't understand what the Forest Service does. And I've heard very similar comments made about any federal or state land management agency. So just tell us who you are, what you do, and why you're doing it. Then people said, thank you so much for the work you do. You know, we really appreciate what you're doing. We just don't have time to come tell you. So we're glad we have this chance to say thank you. And they also said, thank you so much for asking us what we think. We have opinions. We actually care about this landscape. And we just don't have time to come tell you. So we really appreciate the fact that you made the effort to come ask us. Make your decisions based on science and please listen to local views. And there they made the point very clearly that they were talking not just local citizens, but your local agency personnel. They know what the ground is. They know what we care about. Listen to them. And that's it.